Welcome to another edition of the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast. I'm Donald Grodoff, family coach with FamilyOCD.com and FocusedHealthyFamily.com. In the Invisible Wheelchair Podcast series, I delve into the hidden characteristics of OCD, anxiety, and anxiety disorders. The things that most people don't see, that are behind closed doors and shut within the mind about anxiety. My goal with these podcasts is to bring about awareness of Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, or OCD. Understand that I am not a doctor, therapist, or counselor, and the content, information, resources, and ideas that are talked about and brought up here in these podcasts are things that I have used, discovered, or have been recommended to me, and I always recommend to seek additional professional help in finding solutions for yourself. Thank you for listening and enjoy the podcast. This is a repeat podcast, specially for OCD Week. This podcast was recorded on March 6, 2017. This is podcast number 1A, called What is OCD? In the last podcast, we talked about the podcast series itself and what I'm trying to do with it. This particular podcast, we're going to talk about what is OCD. OCD is called Obsessive Compulsive Disorder. Now, I talk about OCD, but it's not my particular issue. In fact, that it's not me that's the one having OCD, but my daughter. But as I talk about it in the work I do, it's really about the family too. So I always say, if one suffers from OCD, everyone in the family suffers from OCD because they suffer in a different way. And that's not to diminish the person who actually is going through it. I don't mean that at all. They suffer more than anybody. But it is a family thing because it affects every part of the family's life, especially in our case. And we'll go through her story in another podcast coming up soon. But, I feel like the severity that we went through with the OCD gives me some rights or rules, I guess, to be able to talk about it. And plus, my daughter has really given me an agreement with this, that I should do this. Because our purpose, I think both hers and mine, is really to get out the message about what OCD is and how devastating it can be. Now, I will talk about other disorders as we go through these podcasts, but they'll be secondary to because I really want to get out the message of OCD. I think too often it is, confused, misunderstood, and really confused by people. They think it's a pretty simple factor of a hand-washing disorder, something of that, or somebody that just freaks out about organization, and we'll talk about that anyway. And I also feel like my daughter was the greatest teacher for me. She helped me to go through what we went through, which was a journey through hell. But in that journey, my family learned a tremendous amount about OCD, what it does to a family. And so it's helped me to want to help others and have a passion to help others because I know the kind of hell that it can take you through. So let me back up just a minute. I'm going to read the official, I don't know if I'd call it official, but the definition of it coming from the International OCD Foundation, which, by the way, you can find at iocdf.org. But here they explain it this way, and I'm reading from their site directly. Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, OCD, is a mental health disorder that affects people of all ages and walks of life, and it occurs when a person gets caught in a cycle of obsessions and compulsions. Obsessions are unwanted, intrusive thoughts, images, or urges that trigger intensely distressing feelings. Compulsions are behaviors an individual engages in to attempt to get rid of the obsession and or decrease his or her distress. Most people have obsessive thoughts and or compulsive behaviors at some point in their lives, but that does not mean they will all have some OCD. In order for a diagnosis of obsessive compulsive disorder to be made, this cycle of obsessions and compulsions becomes so extreme that it consumes a lot of time and gets in the way of important activities that a person values. Now, that last statement was probably the most powerful statement of the definition. This cycle of obsessions and compulsions becomes so extreme that it consumes a lot of time and gets in the way of important activities that person values. What that's really saying, and what happened in our own family, is it literally closes up your life. It becomes, a person becomes so obsessive that they can spend 2, 3, 4, 5 hours literally obsessing over what anybody else would see as a minor detail. I've heard of scenarios, and like I said, we'll go through my daughter's story coming up, I think within one of the next 2 podcasts. But I've heard of some amazing stories of people that, I've heard of a story of a gentleman who used to drive over, as he was driving, if he went over a speed bump, he'd have to stop, turn around, come back and make sure it wasn't a dead body. And he could do this numerous times, and he could do it at each stop. But, I run into a lot of people, and it really kind of upsets me in a way when I'm sitting across from somebody, maybe talking about their neat desk or their clean pantry in their kitchen, or their very obsessively clean car they have, and they say, "Oh, that's just my OCD." And it bothers me for the fact that we use that so lightly without knowing how much it can affect another person, how much it can embarrass somebody or raise their anxiety or get them upset. Because the difference between an organizational person, fanatic, freak, whatever you want to call them, and OCD really has to do with that last line. The organizational person likes to have things neat and does obsess over it a little bit, want to make sure it's nice and neat and clean. But the difference is they can walk away from it. They can say, that's good enough, and walk away. An obsessive compulsive disorder person, an OCD person, can't walk away until it is perfect. And there's no such thing as perfect, because the mind changes the rules constantly. And I think because of that, and because of some of the other parts of it, it's really highly misdiagnosed. Because there are somewhere between 2 to 3 million adults and somewhere around 500,000 kids that are diagnosed with OCD. And again, I feel like that's misdiagnosed. And the reason why, and one of the reasons I really kind of picked OCD to really work on, not only because it's my passion, but I have found through the work I've done and through some of the other stuff I've done, that OCD becomes a subset of a lot of the other disorders. Because it's really, again, as I mentioned, I think in the last podcast, it is about anxiety. It is about the basis of this is anxiety. That's the foundation of most of these disorders, is anxiety. And when you have anxiety, the OCD or obsessive stuff can come pretty easily from that anxiety. Because it is really an anxiety disorder, triggered by the anxiety of those raging thoughts that can go on in the mind that can cause people to do so much, and the anxiety is really about fight or flight. And here again, I'm going to be doing a podcast on fight or flight, but you can also find some videos on fight or flight on my website, Family OCD, because that is the basis. That is what makes anxiety go off the charts, is fight or flight gone off the charts. So, some of the things that cause OCD, well, really the cause of it is a brain misfunction. And the simplest way that I can approach it, because I am not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, I just I've worked with therapists, and I've worked with, people with OCD, including my daughter. And the way it was explained to me from some of the doctors I've worked with, and the way I understand it the best, because it's a much simpler way, is that up in the brain, the neurotransmitters talk to each other. They fire messages back and forth to each other. That's the way a normal brain would work. But when it comes to OCD, and here's the best way I can describe it, those messages tend to backwash, go back into the transmitter that sent it, which is not the way it's supposed to happen. Messages are going back and forth, but they're coming from other, and so it causes a loop in the brain that causes these messages to be repeated over and over and over. And what can happen is, these things can be kind of recessive in a person, and some kind of trauma or some kind of bad event, like a death or violence or car accident, can then, or sometimes even a diagnosis. For instance, the mother that I heard about, this is not one of my clients, but the mother I heard about, that her son was diagnosed with a serious blood disorder. And that triggered within her the trauma behind that, the fear behind that, triggered her to then become obsessed about germs and blood and cleanliness, all of that, and would cause her to wash her hands hundreds of times a day, which sounds unusual, sounds outrageous, but I know from my own daughter, 4 and 5 hours worth of hand washing sometimes. And so these traumas or these bad events or these things that happen to us can then trigger and enhance the OCD to come out. Because some can be inherited, from what I understand. Again, this is a layman's way of understanding it. And then there's also these things called Pandas and Pans. And I'm actually going to go over these deeper. But Pandas stands for Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Pediatric Autoimmune Neuropsychiatric Disorder associated with streptococcal infections. That's a mouthful right there. But what it basically stands for is that because of strep throat, or the strep infection, it can trigger instant onset of OCD. And I believe this is what my daughter went through, because it came like a light switch for us. They've also, and again, you can find out more about this by going to the iocdf.org website to understand. Plus, I'm going to do a podcast on it too. The other one is PANS. That came about after Pandas, and it's the thought that there are other viruses and things that can trigger infectious triggers, they call them, for OCD. So, and some of the things that go on because of OCD, I found the energy in our house was so bad, and I find this with clients too, that you could cut it with you couldn't cut it with a chainsaw. They get stuck, and so that behavior continues. Again, the stress is thick. There's tension then between family members, and especially between the father and the mother, or the husband and wife, because they each believe they have the right way of dealing with it. And so that can cause a lot of friction. There can be friction between brothers and sisters, really the whole family. It starts kind of tearing the family apart, closes their life up. It did for us, so they get down to the basics of eating, sleeping, and working, paying the bills kind of thing, And really what happens that I find is hopelessness. It starts really sinking in. You don't know what's going to happen, if it's ever going to stop, if it's ever going to change. And then other illnesses can happen out of it. In my particular case, a heart attack in the middle of all of it. Financial things can play in, because you're trying everything you can to try to solve it. Trying everything. Maybe this will work. Oh, this will be the next miracle. Oh, this will want to work. And of course, each one of those costs. So financial play into it. You have a problem with friends and relatives really kind of disappearing because they don't know how to deal with it. They don't know how to talk it over. They don't know what to say or what to do. And they think you just want to be alone, which is really just the opposite. And of course, depression can fall in line. Some of the things that I recommend, and again, this is a recommendation. Understand, I'm not a doctor, I'm not a therapist, I can't even call myself a counselor. I do my work through EFT and some alternative practices that are not recognized and licensed. But here's what some of the things that I would probably recommend for this. One, ERP therapy, and I'll talk about that in the future too. It's exposure response prevention. CBT, cognitive behavioral therapy, talk therapy, has its benefits, but you have to do it in a particular way. EFT, emotional freedom techniques, are better known as tapping. And then also understanding diet and nutritional needs and going for some more deeper testing than they do in the medical world, like immunotesting and psychotropic and analgesic testing can really help get to a deeper, more vital sense of what's going on. So it's helpful to find a specific doctor that knows, or a therapist, or a clinic that really specializes in OCD, and I have recommendations for that too. Naturopathic medicine, of course, the medical world plays into it. I'm not giving up on that or downing that in any way. Hypnotherapy and movement therapy all play a role, can play a role, I should say, and there are recommendations, but I'd still always say is seek professional help. And again, there are references to that on the Invisible Wheelchair of places you can go and things you can do. That concludes this podcast. Please leave me a comment or question below. That gives me good direction where to go on future podcasts. I would love to hear your invisible wheelchair stories if you're willing to share it. If you would, go to invisiblewheelchair.com and click on Tell Your Story. I want to remind you that OCD, Obsessive Compulsive Disorder, is treatable, and I can help you get past OCD. So if you have heard this podcast and others, and you feel like you need further assistance and would like to spend some time with me working through any issues you have, then feel free to book a session at focusedhealthyfamily.com or familyocd.com, or you can call me at 704-562-1630. I also offer $85 off initial discovery session if you mention that you heard it on this podcast. I hope you have enjoyed this podcast and will join me for the next one. Remember to keep tapping, talking, and transcending your life to new heights. Thank you, and have a great day.